Well, I think at this point, everyone should be back from the breakout sessions, and I hope you had as engaging a conversation as we did. We're doing things a little bit differently for those of you who participated during the last workshop. We had each of the various breakouts report out. We're not doing that this time around. However, all of those conversations are being captured. I believe even the links for those breakouts are also being captured and the recordings made available. So you have a chance to go back and listen to others if you did not have a chance. I'm just going to reflect on a few things that I heard in our really wonderful conversation, but I also invite other members of that group to chime in because it's really hard to capture the full breadth of everything that was discussed. The first thing that stood out to me was really that exclamation point on we need to rethink data sharing practices that many times we think the patients don't want their data to be shared for a variety of reasons, but they in fact do. And this came directly from the comments that Megan made during the opening session. Many comments around the need to invest in the communities to have patients engaged from the start in setting priorities, determining outcomes of interest, and then those relationships need to be cultivated over a period of time. That when we talk about community, we need to define what we mean by community. The different stakeholders define community differently, and then identifying who those community leaders are. Silas made really emphatic points in terms of making sure that the value goes back to the communities, and we also set aside a return, right? Some kind of compensation for engagement, that we don't just swoop in at the very tail end of the research process and say, community engage with us, but they're not even being compensated for their time. We talked about, from an industry perspective, how things are evolving now in terms of diversity being a major question in every compound research effort, but identifying the appropriate metrics and then being able to have end-to-end visibility in terms of the patients that are being enrolled against each of these compounds are challenging, particularly being guided by various rules in terms of sharing patient data and information across different research projects. So that is a struggle that industry is working through. There are comments around not picking winners and losers and letting the community identify what is important to them. Trust is critical, especially in recruiting leaders in the community. Training is important. Funding at the local level is important. And being thoughtful, again, by what we mean in terms of community. Metrics came up a number of times. How do we define the appropriate metrics for foundational change so that you can measure where you're making progress from point A to point B. Conversations in terms of tools and technologies were really around how do we ensure that we can capture, different learnings and appropriate processes in making, consent forms more user-friendly, and, the difference between what legal needs versus what patients need. So those are some of the comments that stood out from our conversation. And let me just pause here to see if there are other folks from the group who want to comment.
You know what I just mentioned, this is Elena Rios, National Hispanic Medical Association. I just mentioned that we've had experience with the importance of mentoring in our communities among the physicians, to have those involved in research already, especially with clinical trial, to start getting them to become mentors to the next generation, because it is very, I'll just say there's a lot of work involved and a lot of planning. And I think that's something that we don't think about. And also the community health centers could be used, or community doctors need to be considered as part of the community experience that academic health centers often overlook because they're involved in their own systems. That's all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Elena. Other final thoughts from that conversation?
Yes, hi, this is Jacqueline Alicani. I'm a heart patient and volunteer with the American Heart Association and other community groups. And I just want to reiterate, with my experience as a participant in different clinical trials and being a patient rep with the adaptable aspirin clinical trial. I want to just emphasize that education is core. And, we've talked about that. And that is so critical because there are lots of patients who I think, as a patient of color, there are a lot of patients I think who would participate in the trials if they were more educated and informed about how to get involved, and also getting more education to understand what clinical trials are. There are so many people that still don't even know what that is. And that would really foster a lot more trust and help to dispel a lot of the reservations that different ethnic groups have about participating in trials, particularly, historical issues that have been very negative that makes people really feel uncomfortable about being in trials. And when we reach out to work with community partners, we should also remember it's really important to have members of different community leadership group and advocacy groups, people of color, to be a part of the leadership team on these trials. And that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, with the adaptable aspirin trial. We actually did that, and it can be done. And we also need to compensate people for their time because patients have jobs, they have other family commitments. We have to work, to improve all these areas. I think we're on the way, but we still have a lot more to do. So I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation. I love this. This is great.
Well, thank you so much. Those are very helpful comments, and you certainly echoed a lot of the conversations that our group had. Let me let Barbara be your comment just from her own work that she's done in this area.
I just wanted to thank you so much. I just wanted to support some of these thoughts and add a little bit further nuance. I think that as we think about the metrics for diversity, we should be very careful to not lose sight of the impact of social determinants of health and how we collect that data, which we're not doing a good job of now, informs the further analysis. And we haven't spent enough time talking about how to do that as a community and as a general clinical trial enterprise. And right now, we don't really have very good quick indicators of which aspects of SDH we should continue to develop further. So it's either a 40-minute exercise asking very uncomfortable questions often or not at all. And I think we need to spend some more time talking about that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I really think one of the greatest contributions of this group will be thinking about which aspects we can do and take on nationally, and therefore I feel like we're fighting some of the same issues foxhole by foxhole every time we try to do this. Like every time we try to pay patients, we come up or engaged, not patients to be patients, but patients to be part of the team or patients to be advisors or participants. We come up against all these barriers in terms of, is this undue inducement? Is this, and this, and this? All these reasons why it might be a problem. We should take those things off the table. And coming up with educational platforms. So it's not Lilly or the Brigham or, the NIH trying to, quote, educate, but we think about education cooperatively, and it's done as a national effort to finally be more thoughtful about inclusivity and and which is different than diversity. I mean, and then how to take all of that to an equity lens so that what we're doing, it improves over time the health disparities that we see.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Barbara, for those sets of comments. And I think what you're pointing to, even with social determinants of health, is that the full experience of an individual lends them to whether or not they even have the opportunity to understand and participate in clinical trials and research. So thank you for